Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. I am Alicia Swami, and I'm here with Keely Severson and Eric Johnson, and we are exposing mold. Today, we have a special guest, Cary Cooper, who we actually found on Instagram. So I had recorded a video about mold exposure killing children, and there have been some serious situations that have occurred here in the U.S. and abroad of mold exposure in the home not being addressed when the tenants notified their landlords or their property managers. And the dismissal of the severity has basically caused the deaths of 2 toddlers. So these were recent stories. So I actually decided to go back in the history to see how prevalent this issue is. And I wanted to make it known that children are dying from mold exposure. And this isn't something that is new. We set out on a blog post the other day, and one of the photos it read was, "In the age of information, ignorance is a choice." So I think that we in 2022, moving into 2023, the influx of children and their families, including pets, are being harmed by toxic mold. And this is on the rise. I think everyone knows about it by now. In my clip, I talked about Seattle Children's Hospital causing the deaths of children because they refused to replace the heating and cooling systems. Now, I had a conversation a while back with Emily Rochelle from Texas Inspectors, and she mentioned the majority of heating and cooling systems, HVACs, have you will, have mold issues. The majority of them. That's really alarming. So, Cary, you left a comment and you mentioned that you were a lead HVAC technician at a major medical school, and you chose to leave that position because they refused to address the poor air quality present in their buildings due to moldy equipment and duct insulation. You mentioned, and I quote, "The solution was to ignore it and muzzle the one trying to correct and raise awareness of it. I doubt it is any different at any other institution in the world that operates inside the system." We would love to learn more about you and what you have been seeing working as a lead HVAC technician.
Great. Thank you for having me on. I guess the biggest thing that I've seen throughout my entire experience, and I guess I kind of want to get it out front, that since the early 2020, just prior to COVID occurring, is when I left the industry from the standpoint of actually working on equipment, installing equipment, servicing equipment. And since then, I have done inspection services on heating and air conditioning equipment, but that's pretty much been limited to damage claims arising from storm-related incidents, whether it be lightning strikes or hail damage or storm damage. But pretty much the entire career for me goes back to starting in 2008, and I would say that I would agree 100% with what you stated, that a majority of the equipment out there has some degree of mold contamination just by the nature of how the equipment works, the actual process that is taking place inside of that equipment. And chiefly it arises from 2 things in my experience. One, from the fact that during a cooling cycle, not only are you lowering the temperature of the air that is passing through the system, you're also removing humidity, and that humidity turns into liquid water, which then is collected and drained out of the unit. And that's where a lot of the sort of growth of different biological whether it be mold or bacteria, that's where it's given pretty much an ideal environment to grow inside of those systems. As well as that, along with the air being circulated, there's dust and dirt, which is, from what I've learned, is the food for mold. So that's kind of an overview of my, sort of an abridged version of my experiences. But that's kind of the fundamental problem with equipment, is it's an ideal environment for mold and bacteria to grow in.
How often do you think equipment should be replaced? Like, are we using equipment beyond its life expectancy? And basically, once it hits its life expectancy, it becomes this major driver of mold exposure and God knows what else. I think you had mentioned also the insulation breaking apart and coming through.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a combination of factors where you have just I mean, maintenance is an expense, and most of the equipment that I worked on was in buildings that were, they weren't tenant owned. They were owned by whether it be the property management groups or a larger sort of governmental group that basically provided the space for these other institutions to operate out of. So I think that maintenance gets skipped, and also the people doing the maintenance just really aren't aware of the threats that are that can occur inside of those units. So but furthermore, there are sort of design flaws that I had mentioned in my comment there, with the insulation being placed inside of the ductwork, as well as the insulation that's placed inside of the units is it's porous to some degree. It does break down over time, and then that insulation, along with whatever is growing on it, breaks off and makes its way into the airstream.
Now, when you were becoming an HVAC technician, I mean, during your training, was any of this mentioned? Like, here are the health implications of toxic mold. Like, if we're not doing this right, this can cause issues for people in a building. Like, what was your training like in comparison to, I guess, what you were doing in the real world?
I think that definitely there was some awareness there, and I would hope that has changed since it's been 15 years almost since I started my education. But a lot of it was focused on because my program was a combined program that both trained plumbers and heating and air conditioning technicians and installers. A lot of the focus was on the things that had occurred within plumbing systems, but also there's a fairly common disease known as Legionnaire's disease, and that actually resulted from the first case of that was from a cooling tower, which is part of a commercial cooling system that basically uses recirculated water on a unit that's mounted on the roof to kind of reject the heat out of the air conditioning system. The difference being, though, that water and the air that passes over that's never really introduced to the inside of the building, especially from a design perspective. So I think really, as far as looking at the actual units and equipment that handle the air inside of the building, there really was nothing specific related to like the health of the occupants that was strongly educated. It was more, you want to keep the growth like inside of the what they call the evaporator drain pan. That's where, when all the humidity is removed from the air during the cooling process, that's where those droplets of water drip into. And the concern there was to keep that clean so that there wouldn't be a drainage backup that would cause building damage, and also cause the humidities to the buildings to rise.
Thank you for that. I'm just curious, like, going back to your work in medical schools and doing all that. So their major gripe was simply they didn't want to pay for maintenance of their heating and cooling systems. I mean, like, don't they have people on staff that are ready to fix the building at any time? I mean, I used to work in a high-end hotel, and we had a whole staff of engineers that would be on top of the building 24/7 if something broke. It's like, are these schools not operating at that same capacity, that they would rather save on costs than fix any problems within the school?
I think that they definitely do, from a standpoint of keeping the equipment functioning. And also, I guess a lot of that equipment that I had those experiences with wasn't so much in like the critical areas of the buildings, but it was more for areas that didn't serve like specific medical purposes. But still, as we all know, that all the air in the building mixes. So if you have one area that has a mold problem, then that can make its way into, into other areas of the building. But it definitely is that, I mean, I think everyone, even, on a household level, works from a budget. And if there's not sort of that establishment, knowledge that mold in the air can cause all these health problems, they're not really going to address it unless it's something that starts to impact the functionality of the equipment from a perspective of, is it heating and cooling properly? So it's kind of one of those double-edged swords where it's like these institutions kind of they set the tone for the industry, but at the same time, their policies are shaped by the tone of the industry.
I'm curious as to if they were ever in your training or even at the hospital, like, were you ever given any information on how this could affect your health if you were fixing a moldy HVAC system?
Well, I think that there were kind of general precautions as far as, and I guess one thing that I do want to say that I have seen in a lot of facilities, because obviously with myself having health problems, I've been to a lot of different hospitals, both for myself and members of my family. And one thing that I have noticed probably in the last couple of years is that really anytime there's any maintenance done in like a patient room or even in a patient wing, that I see a whole lot more air scrubbers now being employed and isolation that you would see similar to from a remediation aspect. But really the training was more, and this even extends back to times that I was working at like research facilities, government facilities, that it's kind of like in certain areas, there even was, you basically had to be dressed for biohazard conditions. But I think really a lot of the focus was on what was being handled in that particular area of the building, whether it be a biological or chemical agent or things of that nature, not so much something that might be growing in the system. But there are, they're definitely in those areas where there's known threats, there's, special types of equipment that are used, the materials that the equipment is made out of. You find UV light systems and other things to keep growth within those, systems at bay. But just sort of in your general, office spaces that you might find in a medical office building, let's say, that's on the campus of one of these institutions, you don't find that level of precaution available or in place, just as a matter of sort of, that's just not deemed necessary, I guess, from a design perspective.
Are you seeing, as a result of this neglect of, I guess, self-protection or lack of education, are you seeing many other HVAC technicians like you, like, falling ill from their just and exposures in these situations?
I don't, I don't see as many, I guess from a perspective, obviously, being male, that I guess statistically these things impact us less. From what I've read, I'm by no means an expert on the medical end of things, but just from what I've heard from practitioners that treat me and from sort of the information and support that I've found through social media, that's something that more often impacts women, and that it's something that, and obviously within my trade, it's a predominantly male trade. But I even had one teacher in particular that actually died during, my tenure in school, that, and, he had gone from being a competitive bodybuilder as well as, a very highly respected, member of the local, and really, just known for being extra knowledgeable, having a great skill set. And he did a lot of his work in medical institutions, specifically installing and serving the medical gas systems that provide oxygen and nitrogen and other vacuum services to the to the patient rooms and into the ORs and everything else. And he basically, on paper, everything that he was doing in his life would indicate that he would be a healthy person, but he just got these mystery illnesses. He ended up with sepsis. He ended up with going from being a bodybuilder to being confined to a wheelchair and and morbidly obese from maybe from other factors, but that's one that really sticks out in my mind. But also generally I think it's kind of accepted within the work community that, like, the longer you work, the more you age, it's natural that you have aches and pains. It's natural that you start to have back problems and knee problems and shoulder problems. And it's just kind of written off to wear and tear. And I often think about how much of that premature wear is driven by, sort of just an unhealthy inflammatory response that stems from occupational exposures.
Oh, thank you for that. That definitely it makes a lot of sense. And, you said you also have been affected, and visually, just by looking at you, you don't look like a super old guy, you look like a very healthy younger gentleman. And somehow this has affected your health. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about how your work in this field has caused maybe some health issues for you?
Sure. It's, for me, like, I guess mine's a little bit more unique case. I grew up in a home that had mold problems. And sort of growing up, I had some different weird, health issues. I remember one time when I was in my, I think I was still in elementary school. I was a pretty strong kid. I could always, climb to the top of the bull rope in the gym when, back in, I guess I kind of dated myself, but that's, one of our gym activities was see how high you could climb on the bull rope. And I could always climb up to the top and ring the bell. And I remember one day I was playing in my basement and I just felt like I lost all my strength and I couldn't. That was probably halfway through fourth grade. And for the rest of fifth grade, I couldn't make it barely even. I think the best I did was to get halfway up the bull rope and just, told the doctor about it. And it was just sort of shrugged it off. And then, and then I had like some digestive issues. I changed my diet in high school. So a lot of these things sort of self-corrected as I aged. But for me, really and I, of course, growing up on the East Coast, I had some Lyme exposure as well, tons of tick bites. So it's kind of I guess sort of a typical formula that you see for people with sort of mystery illnesses like mine. But it really came to a head when I moved into a house that I knew had a mold problem. It had mold in the bathroom. In addition to my work in the heating and air conditioning industry, I had done a lot of, residential home renovations, and almost every one of those involved some degree of mold if I was either renovating a kitchen or a bathroom. But just kind of living in this really moldy house. And then, the contractor I worked for at the time, kind of serviced a lot of older buildings. So I spent a lot of time in moldy mechanical rooms, working on a lot of poorly maintained swamp coolers, which are kind of popular in the region that I live in now, here in the Rocky Mountain region. And so kind of everything sort of came to a head. And I basically went from being able to work a 50-hour week and then take off on the weekends and either ski both days, or I could go for hikes with my dogs and do a 8, 10, 12-mile hike easily with a 2,000 to 3,000 elevation gain within that hike. And I feel like probably within 8 weeks or so, I went from being at that level of vitality to almost passing out if I would get up at night to go to the bathroom. I would get winded climbing up a flight of stairs, whereas I used to be able to, like I said, take a 2,000 or 3,000 foot elevation gain and just not even get short of breath, even at the top. So yeah, it was a pretty drastic change for me. And I got pretty much the typical response from sort of the standard, medical institutions when I was trying to figure things out. And it really took, I'd say really about, at least three, possibly 5 years to get kind of the full picture of everything that was going on. It was fortunate for me that I'd had some family members that had Lyme disease, so that's right where my mind went. But because I was not in a CDC endemic area, that was like, oh, that's impossible that you would have it. And it actually took me going back to the East Coast, to the home I grew up in with the mold problem, and seeing doctors there that had 30 years of experience treating not mold patients, I'm sorry, but treating Lyme patients. And that kind of chipped away at the illness enough for me to start to see some recovery by treating the Lyme. And then also found sort of over the years some of course, common co-infections, mycoplasma, Epstein-Barr. And then really it was just kind of over the last couple of years, honestly, from the knowledge that I got from other chronically ill individuals on Instagram. And then, of course, folks like yourself that provide so much valuable information to the community, that I really started to understand how much mold had a factor in it for me, from both the perspective of where I lived and the kind of work that I did. And for me, it's still an ongoing, process. And I'm really, fortunate to, have access to providers that are well-versed on all of the issues that I'm dealing with. But, still, I'm definitely not back to where I was before, I got ill, and I'm not sure if I ever will get back to that point, but, at least I'm slowly getting better and I'm not getting worse. So.
Yeah, it's notable that Lyme disease, Legionnaire's disease, came to the forefront in 1976 with that horrible outbreak that killed all those Legionnaires. And mold wasn't even on the radar. Mold wasn't discovered for another 10 years until 1986. So the indoor air quality groups, professionals, they weren't even looking at mold for another 10 years after the sick building syndrome concept was invented.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable to me how long it takes for things to sort of set in. And even kind of reading the stories, I for me, it's kind of the Lake Tahoe Truckee outbreak there that really kind of resonates with me, because you had basically like Olympic level athletes that were being told that they got so sick because they weren't living a healthy lifestyle. So it's like, how much more healthy of a lifestyle can you live?
Absolutely. So you have heard about us.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was amazing. The people up at Incline Village used to complain that if you weren't in training for the Olympics, you almost felt out of place in this society. Everybody appears into mountain climbing, water skiing, mountain biking, backpacking. I mean, it's just nuts. If you had a remotely sedentary lifestyle, you literally felt like you ought to move out of the community. Interesting place. So it was really bizarre that anything weird would ever happen at Lake Tahoe, the last place you'd suspect. So when you, on your quest to discover causes for your mystery illness, did anybody bring up chronic fatigue syndrome?
I don't think it was ever specifically mentioned, but I think that if I look back to sort of my first encounter with, I'll just say conventional medicine professionals, that, I kind of got two impressions. One that it was kind of like, one doctor in particular prescribed, I believe it was, just an anti-inflammatory, which I could have gotten over the counter. And basically was like, you need to, exercise and, your joint pain will go away and stuff. And I'm just like, well, what about all my, other stuff? And then just like, it was kind of just sort of completely ignored. And I was like, but sort of the people that did pay attention to it were more on the like nurse practitioner, physician assistant spectrum. And they kind of, I could tell they were trying to tell me something, but they couldn't say what they wanted to say. And I kind of looking back now that it was like, there's more to this picture. I think at one point, one of them did mention that it's, some of my symptoms sounded like chronic fatigue, but they almost were like, you need to go to a different doctor. Like, you're not going to get what you need healing wise going on this path. It just took a little while for that to sort of settle in. But like I said, I was, fortunate enough that just because of other circumstances, mainly for a holiday visit, that I found myself back on the East Coast, and I got a referral from a longtime client of mine from renovation work to go see this one particular Lyme specialist. And that, when I visited him, he looked at every one of my symptoms and was like, this is pretty much one of my typical cases. But of course, because he had even started his treatment of Lyme disease patients before any real understanding of mold was around, he didn't even, mention like, what's the air quality like at home or anything of that nature. But nonetheless, it still did provide a significant change in my health just to address that one factor in the broader spectrum.
So when you were getting an education and acquiring all these credits and certificates and all the people that are issuing this knowledge, did it ever seem to you that maybe their own knowledge was a little bit lacking somehow?
I'm not sure about for the subject matter that they were teaching. They were definitely very knowledgeable. But one thing that I think back to, that sort of when I started my particular program, and I think this is kind of a standard thing, that you had to sign a waiver that you are knowingly going to go in and be exposed to, dusts, fumes, chemicals. I think there was something in there about sort of like biological threats, things of that nature, that this is basically part of the job, and that, you cannot hold the contractors, responsible for that, essentially. That, and just, there were very few things that were, like I said, if I was working in an area where they were, working with known pathogens, then we were notified and given sort of, protocols to follow and PPE standards. And then also anytime there was an area with, asbestos or, and sort of later on in my professional experience, they started raising awareness of the silicas and those threats to health. But really nothing was really specifically mentioned about, mold and its impact on both the occupants and the, technician itself or themselves, in regards to the industry.
Well, it sounds like having a waiver suggests that they knew that there was a little more risk than perhaps they were letting on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's just one of those things that you're eager to start a new trade. It's a very lucrative trade, still with, the economic slowdown that is impending, I guess. There's still a big shortage of technicians. And I kind of wonder if that's kind of a result of the occupational hazards that aren't recognized, how many, people such as myself don't, have to cut their careers short because of, all these exposures that, have kind of a slow, insidious impact on health.
So you are looking around at other people in your profession and seeing how their health is, their ability to perform in their job is being lost.
Yes, and definitely it's kind of two pronged there. I definitely worked with people that, sort of continued to work their way through it because they didn't have the, the means to find something else. They didn't have the means to start over, and they kind of just, beyond the sort of just, natural wear and tear of a physical trade that, I could just really see that they were, you know, in my opinion, were in much worse shape than they should be for someone that, is kind of getting paid to work out every day. And then there's other people that just, kind of left the trade altogether, or ended up working in, in building maintenance, where they were spending less time sort of in the dirtiest, most hazardous parts of the job, and they were, more kind of handling the lighter maintenance end of things. And actually, just sort of talking about this brings back memories of one of my classmates, that they spent a lot of time cleaning the what's referred to as the condenser side of chillers, and that's where the water that that can contain Legionella circulates through to kind of remove the heat from that chiller. And it was almost like clockwork. Every time they did what they called punching the tubes, every time he would do that service, he would get some sort of a respiratory infection. And he actually ended up being out of work for a little while, because he basically was like, I can't keep doing this, I need to do something else. And they end up laying him off. And it wasn't until he could find a job with another contractor, where it was just more kind of general maintenance work, that he, returned, back to getting on the job experience.
What do you think, Keely? Got any questions?
I don't really have any questions, but there's something that you said that really caught my interest. It sounds like you described when you were in 4th grade kind of getting sick in a way that changed your health. And it almost sounded like it was mold related, but I don't know if you came out and said exactly mold, but the way you described going down into a basement and then losing weakness or losing strength in your body. That happens to those of us who get sensitized from mold exposure, where we'll have one like really significant event that kind of sticks out where our health isn't the same after. And I'm just wondering, is that what that was for you? Like, could you track that time back to like your health kind of changed at that point, like energy, strength? I know you said you regained it at some point after, but I'm just wondering if you were more sensitive after that point. And also if you, like, if when you're in areas, if you can kind of like feel mold in your environment.
Yeah, actually, thank you for bringing that up, because that was something that I kind of thought about before coming on. And definitely as a child, I was the kid that, if there was a disease going around the school, I caught it. So a lot of ear infections, a lot of respiratory infections growing up, but definitely from that point, I mean, it was even throughout high school that I just continued to have, I definitely wasn't like the healthiest kid in school. I got, mono in middle school and probably missed like 3 or 4 months of school. I still participated in sports, but I definitely was not like a, competitive individual. And I just kind of think back to sort of maybe the fitness trajectory I was on up until that point. I definitely did not, definitely did not continue with that. And I definitely didn't regain sort of that trajectory for fitness, really until I moved out of that home. It was, my early or late teens, I moved out of my parents' house and really just didn't really return for any significant portion of time. But I definitely had, sensitivities to chemicals, and still to this day, I'm really kind of I kind of consider myself to be sort of a human canary, because one thing that really sticks out for me recently was just trying to get back into the heating and air conditioning trade, but on like the administrative project management side, sales side. And there were two notable interviews where I went in and my mind was clear. I was answering questions, very precisely. And by the end of the interviews, I could not recall just basic industry terms. I couldn't recall like the names of types of equipment. And even to the extent that in one interview, one of the interviewers just called me out and was like, is something going on here? Are you having some sort of like an attack, basically? And I was like, I'm like, your building has a significant mold problem. I'm like, obviously I'm not here testing it, but I had observed sort of during it, we did a building tour before the interview, and they had some areas that they were renovating, and I kind of could even smell some audible, or not audible, excuse me. I could just smell some actual mold odors. And then during the interview process, I basically just like a great deal of cognitive impairment came over me. So I would say definitely that's something that's very noticeable for me to this day, as well as, looking back kind of historically, I was always the person, despite working over the years in different trades, like working at auto shops and tire shops and everything, that just, there would be certain days just sort of like, I'm sure maybe you've noticed at some point, if you go into a place that sells tires, you're just sort of overwhelmed with that vulcanizing smell from the rubber. And, that would have an impact on me. Just, even riding in friends' cars, if they had an oil leak and that was getting on the exhaust and you were kind of inhaling some burning exhaust or burning oil fumes, like it would make me sick. Whereas other people would just be like, oh, why does that bother you? It's just a smell. So yeah, definitely a very, probably from that point forward, in fourth grade, I've always just been more sensitive to smells and conditions than a lot of my peers.
When you had mono, how long did it take for you to recover?
I really it was, I almost think that I missed a great portion. Even when I returned to school, I think it was probably not until the summer. So I think it probably, the illness started in like during the holiday season, and I really didn't get better until I was, out of school for summer break, before I felt, significantly recovered. And there was a good, like I said, like 2 to 3 months where I couldn't even get to school itself. And then the rest of the time I just spent in school, but still pretty miserable.
Back in the 1980s, it was expected that if you got the kissing disease, Epstein-Barr virus, that you might have a difficult recovery, but within 6 to 8 weeks, any normal healthy adult should be over it. If somebody did not recover within 2 months, that was clearly something wrong. And it seems like doctors have completely forgotten about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the exact, doing a little math here. It was probably at that time I was in middle school in the late 80s, early 90s. So I'm not sure if, what the particular, guidelines my doctors I was seeing at the time were going by, but I do know it actually took a while even to get a good positive test for mono, that it was kind of just, and it, kind of thought to be a combination of illness and psychological factors. Because I know at one point I was referred to a psychologist to see, if it was more about, sort of the typical middle school, preteen issues that were keeping me from going back to school rather than my actual physical health.
Yeah, they've normalized something that used to be so extraordinarily abnormal that all of society knew that a normal, healthy adult does not have a problem with mono. It's a rite of passage. It's the kissing disease. You get it from saliva. When you start making out, you get the EBV. This happens to teenagers, and they typically get over it within 6 weeks or so. And then you've got lifelong immunity. And for some strange reason, back in the 1980s, this was no longer the case. People showed up with a chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome. And this was the precursor, later called chronic fatigue syndrome. And now you talk to a doctor and they look at chronic active Epstein-Barr virus and they don't even blink. But some of the people with the EBV syndrome would complain about these weaknesses, these sensations of going into certain buildings and feeling bad. And they'd go to their doctors and get passed off. They'd have allergy tests, nothing would show up. And some of them go to allergists, and the allergist says, well, yeah, you've got some mild reactivity, some allergies to mold and wheatgrass, some pollen and dander. Get rid of your cat. And all of a sudden the HVAC would kick on and they'd go, oh my God, you've got it right here in your office. And the doctor would say something like, you're not the first person who said that. Well, okay, are you going to look into it? No. These are allergists. And they wouldn't even take interest in what was going on in their own offices.
Yeah, it's amazing. And one thing that I learned that was kind of remarkable for me was that, the first, really successful immunosuppressant that made all organ transplants possible is the mycotoxin. And there's even good friends of mine that I've shared that information with, that I'm just like, how can you acknowledge that works so well in a clinical setting, but it doesn't have any impact, on a person's overall health that's maybe exposed in lower doses through other sources, and they just are like, well, that's just different.
Exactly. Great observation. The mycophenolic acid. Yeah, this stuff is known to be an immune suppressant. And yet, if you hear people talk about sick building syndrome and these mystery illnesses, they always go, inflammation. It's all inflammation. Wait a minute. If it's an immune suppressant, maybe it's the other direction. Maybe it's not inflammation at all. It's having your immune system turned off. And they look at you like you're crazy.
I'm curious, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say this was brought out at the 2019 Mold Congress when Dr. Chin Yang talked about the amazing characteristic of Stachybotrys' evil twin, Stachybotrys chlorhalonata, which puts out the immunosuppressive compounds without the neuroinflammatory ones. And they felt that perhaps many of the times when they thought Stachybotrys was present, but not harmful or exerting an effect, could be because it was this indistinguishable chemotype, this morphologically identical to Stachybotrys chartarum, but it's actually a different type of mold that only shuts off the immune system. So when people show up with all kinds of vague mystery illnesses, but no real overt inflammatory problems, that they should suspect this. And of course, if you have your immune system switched off without any other symptoms, it would stand to reason that you wouldn't be able to get over Epstein-Barr virus or HHV6 or mycoplasma or Lyme disease or pretty much anything else. So Lisa, you were going to speak?
Yeah, it's so interesting that this is so prevalent, yet no one seems to know anything about it, especially in the medical realm. And people have to jump through so many hoops to just get some sort of understanding of what's going on in their body, which is definitely crazy making. And with your experiences and, in all the institutions that you worked for, did you ever just, conduct a survey of your own and go up to doctors in these institutions and ask them about what they think about mold and how it affects health? Did you ever do any of that during your time working?
Um, Not during my time working, but sort of in the process of, because I still see doctors at some of these institutions for basically for other reasons. And like for instance, one of the symptoms I sort of developed was an adult asthma like syndrome that hasn't really been a problem for me lately, but sort of in the process of discovering mold, and I even discovered mold in my own home, in my own heating and air conditioning system, and I kind of gave that information to one of the respiratory, one of the pulmonologists that I had seen, and basically they were like, oh well, we'll we can run some some septum samples, and if we find something in there, we'll just put you on an I can't remember the exact name of the medication, but basically like an anti-mold medication. And I kind of asked them like, well, what about the byproducts from mold? I'm like, could that be an issue? And basically it's like, no, only if you have an active like fungal infection in your body would it be something to be concerned with. So, I mean, that was just one instance, but that's, really kind of the, sort of just the general impression I've gotten from anybody that really hasn't taken the time to, seek out other, sort of forms of education outside of the standard medical system, as far as their, attitudes toward mold.
Out of all of the places that you worked for, how many of them had ongoing mold issues that they decided to ignore?
I think pretty much every building that I worked in either had something related to what was happening inside of the equipment, or what was happening like related to the equipment from a water intrusion standpoint, because that's kind of another part of the whole spectrum related to heating and air conditioning, is that you have rooftop mounted equipment, and a lot of times there's just maybe a single bead of caulk that keeps water from making its way, sort of bypassing the roof structure itself and making its way into the building, at that intersection of the equipment and the roof deck. So that, and it was kind of just like, oh, we'll get to that. We'll have our roofers take care of those kind of things, and then just kind of trying to bring up the fact, well, what about the, resulting water damage? And a lot of the attitude was like, oh, it'll dry out and then it's not a problem. So basically like, we're not overtly concerned about stopping it right now, but we'll get that leak addressed, and then it'll kind of just dry out on its own, and then it won't be a problem anymore. That, basically the only time you can have mold is if you have like an active water leak.
Well, I should bring up a little situation we've run into with this particular paradigm, is that those of us who are familiar with the toxic properties of mold have reached out to many, many doctors and made sure they had a full education and understanding of this phenomenon, and thereafter observed that they pretend that they never heard a thing. There have been prominent doctors out there who for 20 years say, oh yes, mold is serious and dangerous and you should stay away from it. And that's about it. They don't tell people what they know about this and that there's more to the story. So just because a doctor seems sincere and kind of acts like well, yeah, of course we care about mold. No, they really don't. And you really have to watch them carefully. And the only way you can tell when they're doing this is by observing when they've got a full education, and then the subsequent years when they act like they know absolutely nothing about it.
Yeah. And I guess kind of reaching back to Alicia's question there, sort of considering some of my experiences, and one thing even early on in my career, working under some of the more senior technicians, we would take the extra time when doing a maintenance service to to clean the evaporator coil. And that's what I kind of mentioned previously. That's where the cooling process of the air takes place. That's where the water accumulates. That's where any dust or any sort of mold food can accumulate that bypasses filter systems. And that they would take the time to thoroughly clean it. I'm not sure if we were using the proper agents, but they definitely were advertised to us that they would sort of sanitize the coil. And then we would also add they manufacture different chemical formulas of tablets that you can leave in the evaporator pans to basically to stop any mold growth from or any other sort of just general biological growth from occurring there. But we would encounter sort of pushback from either property managers or property owners that we were kind of just performing an extra service that was intended to separate them from their money rather than keep their equipment healthy as well as the occupants healthy. And it's kind of like, because everybody is sort of at the will of the person paying the bill, that these extra services that a lot of people are comfortable with doing that can sort of keep equipment in a much healthier state aren't being performed because of just from a cost basis analysis by someone who doesn't really have any knowledge about actual building health, or perhaps really just doesn't care about building health because they're not the ones that are sick, or they're not the ones that have to work there or live there. And like I said, there's plenty of readily available products from a perspective of what's stocked at supply houses and other wholesalers that cater to the industry. It's really just not used across the board, I think, from a perspective of that some people just think it's sort of nothing more than another thing to charge the customer for, rather than something that's really essential to the overall dynamic of building health.
Yeah, there's mold testers out there now saying that you should just consider all conditions which are propitious for mold growth to be a toxic health hazard and treat them as if they were a hazmat situation. You have to use full-on protocols for every situation. That's not economically feasible, and it doesn't even make sense. And yet every now and then, some mold colony will pop up, and it really does make people terribly sick. So how do you tell the difference? And that's the situation we're in right now. We don't always know. We can't predict.
Right. And definitely it's obviously one of those situations, and an ounce of prevention in this case can prevent tons of problems. Just from a perspective, if you get in a routine of maintenance and observation from the very start, even prior to the equipment is installed, how it's stored on the job site. You combine all those little factors in the beginning, and that can really have a huge impact on how the system functions over its lifespan. And then of course how it's maintained through that lifespan. There's really a tremendous return on investment for kind of going with the best standard of practice from a maintenance standpoint, rather than waiting till you have a problem. And not only do you have to deal with the expense of equipment replacement, but how do you contain what's in that equipment that's harmful to the building while you're trying to replace it in essentially a finished space.
Absolutely. This is a major challenge for our time. How do we deal with something that just gets into the air and fills up a building? So this has been sort of our goal, to get top researchers to address some of these questions. Is there any way to make this more predictable, so that we don't have to panic every time we see a spot of mold?
And I guess one thing that I observed, because I still have some friends in the industry, that are working actively in the field, as well as people that work on the administrative, sales, project management side. And unfortunately, I've lost some contact with some folks, but definitely at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was all of a sudden this huge focus on air quality, installing different treatment systems. And, it seems like kind of like that, maybe was the case for about a year and a half. And then it sort of just fell by the wayside. And, but from my perspective, I was really enthusiastic about that, because, I was like, okay, finally, maybe, just even though it's not the target of these sort of design changes, it's definitely going to have a huge impact on, the ability of mold to grow in these pieces of equipment. And now it seems like that's sort of been maybe not, completely abandoned, but it's not right at the sort of the top of the list from a design perspective, like it used to be, just even in, basically a handful of months ago.
Yeah, it seems like after a burst of enthusiasm, things kind of lose their steam and go back to business as usual.
It's just been so crazy and manipulative. I feel like how the agenda has been pushed as to like, oh, now we care about air quality. Whereas before they never did. It's like COVID is the one that really pushed forward, like you said, the use of air scrubbers and all this stuff. Like, when in the history of viral illnesses have we ever cared about increasing or improving our air quality in buildings and transmission of these things? Like, people used to go to work with the flu sick, not caring, right? And all of a sudden we have something similar to the flu, and now we're focused on indoor air quality and air health and all this crap. It's just, I feel like it's one big manipulation to make us think that we need to be just concerned about viral transmission, when really maybe there's something bigger at play, and it's actually the mold. And they're not saying the mold, but they're saying everything else but the mold. We sat in on a White House interview or meeting that they had the other day. It was like a 3-hour summit where they talked about all the aspects of what the country is going to do to increase indoor air quality and improve infrastructure and improve living conditions for people in Section 8 and of lower economic status. And not one mention was there mold in that conversation. It was, oh, we need to make sure we hood all of the stoves so that way people aren't inhaling cooking particulates and they don't get sick from that, or COVID transmission, or climate change and the growing of, wildfires and all this other crap that they like to throw on and give excuse when they're not going to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem that we're seeing really is the mold growth, and how that is affecting our air quality. So I know, to all of our listeners, just to cap this conversation off, what are some, I guess, tips or pieces of advice that you would give to people listening today that they can use to keep their HVAC systems mold free and ensure that it stays mold free?
Well, I think, just kind of like anything else in the home, that regular maintenance is essential from a standpoint of, filter changes, but also, like, you've got to make sure that your filter is actually well sealed, because you could have a MERV 13 filter, but if 40% of the air bypasses it because there's not gaskets in place or anything else to keep it airtight with the system, that you're not going to get the full benefit of it. As I've mentioned, there's different cleaning products, definitely, as far as from an annual perspective, like prior to the cooling season, and then also at the end of the cooling season. I definitely recommend having the evaporator section cleaned and inspected. And, there's definitely a good number of products on the market, probably now more than ever, as far as UV systems that you can have installed in your ductwork, both on the supply and return side, as well as, there's I guess there's some debate to the effectiveness of things like, plasma generators or whatever, but, I definitely know from a personal perspective, I've seen a good increase of air quality at home using some of these systems. And I guess, there's debate from a perspective of sort of standalone air cleaner systems, but from my experience, I've installed, different standalone air cleaners in different rooms of my houses, of my home. And, I basically have taken recommendations from, kind of some of the prominent names in the mold industry, many of which have appeared on previous podcasts that you folks have had. And, I've found a great success for myself as far as, just even generally keeping allergies and, respiratory infections at bay, and also not just for myself, but just for my whole family. So, but I think it's probably important that whatever professional is performing service in your home, that they, have an understanding of the impact of mold, and that they're knowledgeable in it, and that they acknowledge the impact on human health. And, obviously I'm not in a position here to list off, contractors in different cities or anything, but I definitely know there are, professionals that work within the mold world, you would say, that do have those referrals available. And I would, if you're concerned, I would definitely, go through them to find if they have someone that they approve of in your area.
If there's continuous mold growth in like someone's HVAC system, is that just a sign for just a complete replacement, or is cleaning just ultimately the only way to, I guess, to keep your air clean in your home while using one of those systems?
I would say that probably, previously I thought, anything can be clean, but like I said, from just kind of following the information that's been disseminated by a lot of your guests, that it definitely can reach a point where you just can't, especially depending on the sensitivity of the individual living in the space, as well as the condition of the equipment, that it might just reach a point where it can't effectively be cleaned. That sort of that, the residual either mold growth or just fragments of dead mold, essentially, that can accumulate in the sort of little nooks and crannies of ductwork and equipment, just can be enough to continue to cause someone health problems. And then, really at that point, the equipment and the ductwork system itself may end up having to be replaced to sort of reach a point where full recovery is possible.
Well, we're seeing evidence that, and actually we've seen anecdotal evidence in people's descriptions for many, many years, that the very idea that spores and fragments removes the problem is a false premise. That the toxins absorb onto even porous materials and cannot be removed. They stick there by molecular bonds. And these mold experts keep saying, well, we washed everything, so therefore all your problems are gone. They must be gone. How many times people say they don't look into it, because from their view, once those spores and fragments are removed, it's impossible for anything to be there. So that's kind of the effect. That's the mystery that we want resolved, is why is it that something that they don't know about is stuck onto objects, can be brought into our presence, keep us sick, and by their standards, it doesn't even exist.
Yes, definitely. And there's many, and again, depending on the design of the ductwork, ductwork systems are still being produced today that have insulation on the inside to help control sound, but yet that's a perfect environment for what you described, for where even if all mold growth and spore fragments and everything else are removed, that's the perfect environment for, for those, the root cause chemicals to, grip onto. And just, I couldn't think of, from my experience anyway, to clean that. I kind of think about when, someone gets their carpets cleaned at home, it's like, yeah, the carpets look clean at first, but you give it 2 or 3 weeks and it's almost like the dirt sort of just comes back magically. And I think it's probably a very similar situation with, any sort of insulation material inside of any of this equipment or any of the ductwork, where it's just sort of a permanent depository. And once you get, get the bad stuff in there, there's really, the only option is replacement.
Yeah, that flexible fiberglass ductwork, I mean, it's supposed to be completely sealed. All that plastic on the inside is supposed to keep those fiberglass particulates out of the air. And people have been really, really poor about rips and tears or the ductwork falling apart, so that every time the air goes through, it's picking up a little bit of those glass fibers and you get to breathe them.
Yeah, and I guess, and one thing of note is also that, kind of from a filter perspective, that sort of your cheapest filters that are probably going to be most often used in a situation where, I guess from a tenant perspective, that if you're not responsible for the cost of maintenance, that if it's the property owner, the property manager, most likely that's what's going to be used, and those are actually made of fiberglass.
Incredible.
So and that's always, it's always puzzled me, even before I really experienced any significant health problems as a worker and a student in the industry. I felt that was just a really bad idea to make a filter out of something that's, depending on which health authority you speak to, is or has been listed as a cancer threat, and who knows what other kinds of health threats as well.
So that's what we need to do. If we see something that really doesn't make sense, call out our experts on it and ask them, why are they doing this?
Absolutely. But I I guess that like one thing that is sort of refreshing for me as a professional, that, and again, this ties into events of recent times, is that people have been much more aware of not only just the basic need to change filters, but putting higher filters in their systems, changing them more often, and sort of there was always kind of a myth, I think, almost in the industry, that if you put a higher efficiency filter in, that it's gonna cause more basically more drag, and therefore you're going to consume more energy. And that was kind of always one reason that I heard to not put a higher efficiency filter in. But a lot of the filters that are available now, they've actually, the way that they, even though it filters more finely, they also have more surface area to sort of negate that effect that would increase the end user's energy consumption.
Well, a major problem with this particular substance that we're dealing with is that the agent, whatever it is, sticks in a filter, and even though the larger portion of it may be caught, the volatilized portion, the agent that affects us most strongly, comes out of the filter anyway. So the filter becomes a source point rather than helping remove anything harmful. But we can get into that for another discussion.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much, Cary, for joining us. We appreciate it. I hope it wasn't too crazy of an interview for you. Again, we do appreciate your perspective, and just in the side of the heating and cooling systems and what you're seeing in hospitals and government institutions, I feel like this conversation definitely has been much needed and wanted by our audience members, by us, because we just really want to know what's going on. If, landlords and property managers are ignoring it on their end, doctors are ignoring it on their end, what are these bigger institutions doing? Are they addressing it, or are they also ignoring it? And it seems like now, kind of what you mentioned earlier, that everyone kind of has this awareness of like indoor air quality being highly important. And it seems like we're moving into that direction. I just hope that mold gets, called out into that mix and not just climate change and COVID. Let's really get to the truth of the matter here. So, yeah, I don't know if you're working right now or if you're consulting. I don't know if it would be appropriate for me to ask for your information if people want to reach out to you. It's really whatever you're comfortable with, Cary.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'll pass some information along. I'm not really like set up right now, from a official business perspective, but the further I've gone in my journey to recover from my health, the more I've realized that I need to kind of take all my professional experiences and make that available to the public to, to help other people, both, from a perspective of worker protection, as well as, for the health of just the individual in general. And I guess just one thing that I kind of just popped into my head, and I'm sorry to add it at the end, but one thing that I have observed consistently throughout, my career is that the one place that really did have the best practices as far as air quality was daycare facilities. And that would also include care facilities within some of these other problem institutions, that they would always have for sort of what I would consider a general space, not like a sort of lab specific or patient specific space, but just from a general occupied space perspective, that they would have the best practices as far as, filtration, UV light systems, outside air percentages, all that stuff. So I think that kind of speaks to, sort of the observations from an industry that works specifically with, some of the, I don't want to say, with those young developing immune systems, there seems to be a lot of pathogens that pass around, and it seems that they've figured out that there's definitely a cost benefit to, protecting the air quality in those spaces.
There's nothing worse than having dead children on on your rap sheet. I feel like that, I don't know, maybe they have more care or concern for that. I hope. I'm not really seeing that universally, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think everyone is fully aware. Whoever needs to know knows about what's going on. So at least that's good to note that they are, at least taking the time to, I guess, produce better air quality or maintain good air quality in these daycare facilities. So yeah, Cary, once you get something up and running, let us know. We'll go ahead and put your information out there. And I really don't want to bombard you now, since it sounds like you're in the development phase. I'm sure there'll be a ton of people trying to email you and ask you questions. So we'll save you from that. And when you're ready, just let us know. Okay.
Okay. Sounds great. Today's experience has been a tremendous catalyst for that. So it'll be hopefully not too much longer.
Yeah, awesome. And we'd love to maybe have you on in the future for a live or something where we can do a Q&A or something like that. We'll reach out later on in the future. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. It was wonderful, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to just stop the recording.